Hi, everyone. Today, let's go ahead and talk about late modernism. So first of all, I should say that these first two writers that I'm including this week are not technically late modernists, really. They're just kind of hard to fit in with the other categories that we had. So Claude McKay, and I didn't want to give you more reading last week because T.S. Eliot is a lot. But Claude McKay is a really important writer. I think he's one of the writers, many writers from this unit that tends to get wrapped up in American lit classes, um, because he did live in America for a long time and died in America. And he was part of the Harlem Renaissance, right, which is such an important American literature movement. But he's actually born in Sunnyvale, Jamaica, and which is a British British occupied island um, for a long time. And Jamaica is I didn't know this, but it's the third most populated Anglophone uh, place in North America or in America, in the Americas, after the United States and Canada. So, England had a lot of influence there during their occupation, their colonization of the island. And so basically what happened was they brought a lot of African slaves to Jamaica. There were sugar plantations there. And then once they abolished slavery in, oh shoot, I'm gonna forget the year. I think it's 1843 that England did. So then they didn't have, they did not have African enslaved people there anymore. Um, working on these plantations. However, they did then a lot of people who were there, a lot of people who were there who were now free were still working on these plantations for, some wages. What ended up happening was a lot of the people who had been enslaved started their own farms, subsistence farms, right? So just kind of growing their own foods and everything. And then the British ended up bringing in indentured servants from India and China. So basically, the British people who were living there, the white British people who were living there, weren't doing, they weren't working these sugar plantations. They were bringing in laborers from other countries to do this work for them, but they were absolutely occupying Jamaica and continued to do so for a long time. And there's still British culture there for sure. So McKay, he grew up there, born there in 1889. So, his parents were farmers. This was long after people had been enslaved there. But at the same time, there was definitely still the impact of that. And we can see some of that. He talks about his experience growing up there in this this writing I wanted to share with you because I just thought it was really great. You don't have to read it for class, but just if you're interested. And then his brother, who was an English teacher, and I think also a writer, and then his British neighbor, Walter Jekyll, both were kind of introducing him to a lot of poetry, and British poetry in particular. And Walter Jekyll actually told McKay that he should write in dialect. And so if you look at some of Claude McKay's poetry, especially his early poetry while he was in Jamaica, it's written in dialect. And, I think it's kind of interesting to compare some of those poems with the one that we read for this week, which is, a Shakespearean sonnet, right? And it's so it almost feels very traditional in its language and definitely in its form. So, okay. Still experimental, but more so in terms of content, right? So Claude McKay ended up going to Kingston for a job. The city was, so where he grew up was like predominantly Black. When he moved to Kingston, it was predominantly white. And he experienced a lot of racism there. He lived there for less than a year before he moved back to where to his hometown. And then he ended up publishing some books of poetry while he was still living in Jamaica. And one of them won a big award. He got a stipend. And so he ended up going to the United States to study at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and then later at Kansas State. And then, he kind of moved around after that, but and became like a hugely important poet. But he just has such a great biography and seems like a really, I mean, even this photo, he just seems like a really interesting person. So if this poem intrigued you, I would encourage you to read more about him. And you can hear him too. There's recordings and things, because we're getting into the time period when they were taking photographs and recording people. Okay, so this, like I said, I think I already said this, but this is a sonnet. This is a Shakespearean sonnet, not Petrarchan. It's written in 1919, and so kind of amid this red summer, which was a time period in the United States when these white mobs were going around and attacking and killing Black people in the country, or throughout the country. So this was happening all over, not just in the South, by the way. And in fact, a lot of this was happening in the North because this was a kind of early Great Migration. So Black soldiers are coming back after World War I. They've served, and then they're kind of certainly not treated as equals in World War I, but treated with more respect, more opportunities. And then when they come back to the United States, things hadn't changed. And there was also economic turmoil at the time. There was this idea that there weren't enough jobs, and I'm sure that's true, that there weren't enough jobs. And so what happened was a lot of white people were closing ranks to make sure that they were getting the jobs and that Black people couldn't get the jobs. But there was still this perceived threat. And partly because there was, a lot of people trying to get people to be scabs during labor union, activism and things like that. So anyway, there's just like a lot going on at the time, a lot of tension in the United States, and this was something that happened. That was kind of, I don't even know how to talk about it. It's just so terrible. It's just something that happened, and it's one of many of these kinds of events. And Claude McKay, he's not from America, or from the United States, but he is speaking with such camaraderie that that's something that people have remarked on. And I shared a podcast with you that I think is really interesting. It's not too long. And you can even just read the transcript of it on Poetry Foundation. But the people there speaking are talking a lot about like this idea of the African diaspora, and basically just as an effect of especially England's colonization of the world, which we talked about a lot with the Victorian era. There are now, there are African people all over the world now. And so there's this idea of this like race consciousness. And this is where we're seeing a lot of the early examples of that, where people are speaking as a unit and as a community and seeking unity to fight oppression. Okay. So coming back to this poem, what we see here, we see this idea of, if we must die, it's about fighting, it's about war in some ways, right? And so we know it's about the Red Summer, but it's also about these Black soldiers coming back from World War I. And it's just interesting because this is included a lot of the time in war poems, which is a major part of the modernist era that we haven't gotten a lot of chance to read. This one and the T.S. Eliot Wasteland are two that we sometimes like look to as examples of this. But if you want to look at more of this type of poetry, Wilfred Owen is a major poet, war poet, and there's a lot more out there. In fact, I can share from Poetry Foundation. They have a collection that's pretty great. Okay. If you notice about the tone of this poem, it is obviously dealing with a very dark subject matter in history, but the tone is encouraging, inspiring, like I said, just kind of encouraging a sense of unity, camaraderie. And it was, by the way, published in a communist journal at first, or communist magazine. And so, there's also kind of speculation about that in terms of who the audience for this poem is and things like that. So the fun kind of fact about this poem is that allegedly Winston Churchill read this in front of Congress, and then later during the Blitz, to kind of encourage people, encourage Congress to support the war, encourage the British people to feel, to feel, I don't know, hopeful in a moment of destruction during the war, right? And so it's kind of funny how this poem has ended up being repurposed after its, pretty specific mission at the time and messaging at the time, which has never been really disputed. It's clearly in response to Red Summer. So I just wanted to point that out to you. Let's move on to Mina Loy. Not as as an easy a figure to celebrate for sure, as Claude McKay, but so she was born in 1882, lived till 1966. Again, this is another person who moved to America and died in America. She died in Aspen, I believe. And so she was pretty like upper middle class Britain, and she was sent to Munich at 17 to study art. And the description that I read of this was that her father was indulgent, and so her family didn't really believe women should have formal education, but she was so, her father loved her so much that he sent her, even though that wasn't something that was expected, right? And so she ended up starting as a visual artist. She's really into futurism, avant-garde, and so this is like very extreme art. Okay, they are like trying to push boundaries in ways that maybe we kind of take for granted now. But I mean, if you think about how shocking this was at the time, Cubism and all this kind of stuff that we associate with these movements, um, it was very literal, it was very radical, it was very violent. Um, and so we can see a lot of that in Loy's life and work, including her art, visual art, and her writing. And her writing was often like too radical to even be published. And I think Poetry Magazine, on their bio of her talk about how they're like, well, our editor actually thought she was too much, and so did not publish her. Um, so yeah, and so a little more bio though, she was married, was unhappy. Her husband ended up leaving I can't remember where he moved, but somewhere he left the country. And then her first child died, her second child had polio. And so she ended up becoming sort of a Christian Scientist, which I don't know if you know what that means, but sort of like a kind of like an early anti-vax, but it's religious. Sorry, my best friend from high school was Christian Scientist, so I'm maybe talking about it a little too casually, but this is like a religious type of belief, or a religious belief that about kind of like your mental, using your mind to and your connection with God to like overcome illness or to prevent illness. And illness is a result of temptation from the devil. Again, this is my knowledge just from my best friend in high school, and so please forgive me if I've said something incorrectly. So the Feminist Manifesto, this is something that she did not actually publish. She never sent it for publication. She sent it to her best friend, or she sent it to her friend, Mabel Dodge, who was an author and a patron of the arts. And so I think that she had hoped maybe that this would be published, but it never was. It's pretty clearly inspired by the Blast Manifesto. And so if you look at that, you'll see they're very visually similar, and also in terms of their tone, they're pretty similar. Blast is maybe a little more playful. And so if you're feeling like, wow, this is like shockingly violent and angry, maybe that it was intended to be that way. I do think that there are some things that maybe I'm not picking up on that are supposed to be more like obviously, not to be taken as seriously, or like more playful. And so, it's possible. Okay. So she's very radical. Her poetry shows that, like I said. And then we can see this, or her writing shows that, I mean, and we can definitely see this with her pretty clear call to eugenics, right? Where she's saying, what is it that she says? Women of superior intelligence should realize their race responsibility, right? It's gross. There's really no other way of putting it. And eugenics was much more popular at this time. Certainly, we think of this with things like the survival of the fittest and things like that Darwin introduced to us, right? And this social Darwinism. The British people, they took Darwin's writing and really ran with it as this idea of like a justification of them being the greatest due to the way that they had kind of forcibly taken over so much of the world. Couldn't have done that if they weren't so superior, is kind of their thinking there, which is, I think we can see what that really was now, looking back. Okay, so there's also this idea here of girls receiving surgery to take away their virginity. I mean, it's one of these things where we don't really, that sounds so gross, and it is. But the idea being that women were so controlled by in this time for their purity. And so this is her way of saying, this is how we fight back. This is how we prevent, them from keeping us so caged. Okay. And so if we look at civil disobedience, militant civil disobedience of suffragists at the time, you might be able to see some echoes there in a little bit. I think that might be a helpful comparison, especially if this just feels like completely indecipherable, like you're just like, what is she doing? I would encourage you to look at militant suffragists, because, I know we talk a lot about nonviolence and things, and that's, literally what I wrote my dissertation about, but people have fought in ways that are not nonviolent for rights. And so we can see that, for example, with women suffragists. In other words, they didn't have the right to vote, okay, until 1918, and that was only women over 30. And so it wasn't until 1928, actually, that women were able to vote in UK. All right. Dylan Thomas, and I know we're moving right along. I'm pushing against the clock right now. So Dylan Thomas, 1914 and 1953, born in Wales, to a seamstress and an English teacher, another English teacher in the family here. I'm hoping I'm inspiring, someone to become a great poet. So he ended up leaving school as a teenager to become a reporter. So you can see some of his reporting, his journalism early in his life. When he's a teenager, he's publishing. Later, he moves into poetry. And one of the things about Thomas that's so frustrating is that because he doesn't neatly fit in to this era, he's sometimes dismissed as not being as good of a poet as he was celebrated as at the time. He was pretty popular during his lifetime. And he would, he would tour the US, like, Dickens and others that we've read about. And he was just so popular because he was such a great reader and performer. He struggled with alcoholism, and so there's elements of his life that are not as, I'm sure that affected his charisma, but he was so charismatic that people were really being drawn into him. And he was very popular. Again, something that's used to say, well, maybe he was just popular because he was so charismatic, but I hope, even if you don't like his poetry, I hope we don't just outright dismiss him, right? And so, yeah, he died very young, 39 years old, of complications from his alcoholism. So, "And death shall have no dominion" is one of his most famous poems. It comes from Romans 6:9, "Knowing that Christ being raised from the dead dieth no more, death hath no more dominion over him." This is like a very, interesting reference. Dylan Thomas isn't necessarily like, if we're comparing him to other poets, he might not be like the most religious poet we'll ever read. But he does use a lot of Christian imagery in his work, but he's usually juxtaposing it with stuff from like Welsh folklore, and just kind of like more, and some more like ordinary things as well. He's very approachable, as you might have noticed. Like, his work is so much easier to read than, for example, Eliot, more conversational. He has a really good grasp of language. That's something that he's praised for. Even if people don't like his poetry, they're like, well, he does have a way with words. So this is a poem about death, which we've certainly read a lot of this unit, but you probably notice this has a lot more optimism in it. There's more spirit, there's more hope, right? And so this might come from his sort of philosophy about the continuing process of life and death and new life that links to generations. And he just kind of looks at things in sort of a more like, almost like naturalistic, some of the stuff that I was reading, and I mean, this is like such a stupid comparison, so please forgive me, but almost reminds me of like the Lion King, some of the ways that he's talking about life and death and the circle of life, and so it's just kind of like an acceptance, I think, of death, But that not being something that is so horrible and gross, like in in some of the other works we've read, like Eliot. Um, Poem's been referenced a lot. I just want to point out some of these they're just so referenced. And this one too, this is his most famous poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. Excuse me. So this is going to be like a pretty conversational sounding poem, probably. This is one of my favorite poems from when I was a teenager, long before I knew anything about poetry, and I still would not call myself like a a poetry expert. I guess I'm gonna have to get another PhD before I can really feel confident about poetry. But and I think specifically forms like the villanelle are intimidating to me, and I see what it is, but it just feels so complicated. Like I feel like when I know it's a villanelle, I can see it, but I don't know if I would feel confident that I could spot one if I was reading a collection. So anyway, but yeah, so this is a highly structured poem made of 5 tercets followed by a quatrain with 2 repeating rhymes and 2 refrains. If you look at this helps me, I think, to kind of mentally parse this poem, but A1, A2, there are going to be these 2 phrases. So that's pretty simple, right? And so he's going to repeat these at certain points in the poem. And then the lowercase letters represent rhyme scheme. Okay, so there's going to be rhymes within the poem, and then there's going to be these repeated refrains. I love Seamus Heaney. I don't know if there's any Seamus Heaney fans out there. I think we're reading him in the next couple weeks, maybe next week. So he wrote about Dylan Thomas and this villanelle, and I just thought that this was a great quote from him. Oh, and I can't believe I'm forgetting something really important, which is that so he published this poem shortly before his father died, and he says father in the poem, and so some people question whether or not we can take that literally, but I think it's probably safe to say that it is about his dad, and he could probably feel that his time was coming. And then Thomas himself died only a year later, and so it's just kind of like one of those sad ironies because it is kind of a freak. He had alcoholism. Potentially that he would have eventually died from alcoholism, but it is just so sad to think that he wrote this poem about death, kind of sounding sort of like he's like sort of begging his dad not to die, to hold on a little longer, and then just kind of the fact that he actually died himself. Um, just in case we thought we had one hopeful moment in modernism, here we come back crashing down to reality. Okay, W.H. Auden. So this is a poet who it's hard because it's like I can't talk enough about his biography. He was so important and considered important during his lifetime. People, when he was very young, were talking about him as being kind of the poet of his generation. And so I can only imagine the kind of pressure that that would put on a person. But he was, pretty privileged and educated. He was born in York to a doctor and a trained nurse. I guess she never actually practiced, but and then he was educated in private schools. He went to Oxford. This is where he was part of a group called the Oxford Group or the Auden Generation. So literally when he's in college, they're like, yeah, the Auden Generation. So these are some leftist poets and writers who adhered to various Marxist and anti-fascist doctrines and addressed social, political, and economic concerns in their writings. As Auden continues living and living and living, his writing does become more personal. And so he's pretty influenced by like T.S. Eliot and stuff early on. And then as he continues in life, he becomes a little bit more, his writing feels more personal. There's still that objectivity to it. There's still kind of that irony or kind of a coldness sometimes, like a distancing. But again, like much more personal. And so he moved to the United States in 1939. This is when we see a lot of his like greatest poems being published. All the ones that we're looking at are from this time period. And this is also when he met his partner, his life partner, Chester Coleman, who, you know, they were together until Auden died. I'll just say that. Okay, so Auden was known in part for his love poems. And this is one of his most well-known. So Auden was an openly gay man in a time when that was like not legal and certainly not like socially as accepted. And I just wanted to point out too, it was not that long ago that Oscar Wilde literally went to prison for having a relationship with a man, and then, you know, kind of it ruined his whole career. Not only his career, but because he was gay, it ruined the movement that he was part of ended. And wasn't looked at as fondly for a long time because of it. It was just kind of like, oh, that's that movement that that gay guy did, you know, and it's like, oh my God, like just horrifying to think that that was the culture back then. Um, and so I think that reading Auden's love poetry then just feels a little bit more like, you know, it's a love poem, it's part of a long tradition, right? But at the same time, it's like there's something a little more radical when I think we have that context that he was openly gay. And in fact, he married Erica Mann, who is the daughter of Thomas Mann, in a marriage of convenience because she was a lesbian and the Nazis were um, they were going to take her citizenship away, and so she was basically under a threat from Nazis who targeted the queer community right at the time. Um, Sorry, very heavy. So like I said, this poem is written around 1939, the same as these two other poems that we'll talk about. So, and I'm going to apologize now because I do not speak French, but Musée des Beaux-Arts. This one is an ekphrastic poem. And I put this in the discussion board, but in case you missed it, I know those are such long posts. This is on the landscape with the fall of Icarus by Peter Bruegel the Elder. Well, technically it's not by him, but that's who Auden thought it was. It's a recreation actually. But there's another poet who wrote about this exact same painting, which I think is fun, William Carlos Williams. And so, but we can see over here that Icarus is drowning. And these like this farmer and this herder, like, or the shepherd, I mean, they're just like going about their business. In fact, they look kind of like peaceful and serene. They're just like enjoying. He's like looking up at the sky. This dog's just hanging out with his doggy life. What is the line? There's a really great close reading of this poem at the NewYorkTimes.com. I honestly just don't think I can do this poem justice in the way that this reading does. So this is really interactive and cool and easy to read. So I would just encourage you to read this. All right. And then In Memory of W.B. Yeats. So this one is written shortly after Yeats died in January of 1939. And it's broken up into three sections, and those three sections are not super similar. And I think Auden is doing that intentionally, right? He's creating different metrics and length, stanza lengths, and you know, there's just like a lot going on in terms of form. And he played with form a lot, and he was like known as being an incredible formal poet, you know, wrote in lots of different technical forms, but also a lot of free verse. So, okay. So if we look at this, it's broken up into three sections. And then the third one, though, is going to have a more traditional rhyme scheme and be kind of playing a little bit more off the more traditional type of elegy poem. And so I got this from the Literary Encyclopedia. But basically the writer here says it boldly recast the conventions of formal elegiac verse for a disenchanted modern age, which is like, what a cool thing for somebody to say about your poem. But one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that poetry makes nothing happen well, it's in this poem. And this is a line that we associate with Auden, even though it's not necessarily super representative of his philosophy forever. This is something that he is known for having written, and it's extremely widely recited as a line from him and just like kind of as a sentiment. So listen for that as you continue studying literature. You might find more of it. All right, that's it for this week. I hope you have a great day.